On the surface, the Grant family looked like the kind of family people admired from across the street. Their two-story home sat neatly on a quiet suburban block, framed by trimmed hedges and a white picket fence. Neighbors often pointed to them as an example of stability. A successful father who ran the family business with his brothers, a warm and devoted mother who volunteered at church, and their daughter Isabella, a bright 19-year-old college student known for her good grades and polite smile. To outsiders, the Grants represented the American dream, comfortable, respectable, untouchable. But what no one could see from the sidewalk was the tension simmering beneath the surface, a tension that would one day explode in a way so violent, so unthinkable, that would forever change how people remembered that house. The head of the family was Thomas Grant, a man in his mid-40s with broad shoulders and a reputation for being stern but fair. He carried himself like someone who had worked hard for everything he owned, and he was fiercely protective of his daughter. His wife, Elena, softened his edges. Friends described her as gentle, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and always asked how your kids were doing. Together, they seemed like the perfect pair, until life reminded everyone that perfection is only an illusion. At the center of their world was Isabella. With long dark hair and a soft voice, she was the kind of girl who could have easily slipped into the background, but her quiet confidence drew people to her. She was the first in her family to attend college, and she was determined to make her parents proud. That spring, Isabella was preparing for final exams, determined not to let distractions pull her off course. While her cousins and friends talked about parties and summer plans, Isabella buried herself in textbooks. She carried the weight of expectation not just from her parents, but from the Grant name itself. The Grants were not just a family. They were a small empire. Thomas and his three younger brothers, Martin, Peter, and Caleb, ran a logistics company that had grown steadily over the years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and it gave the brothers status in their community. They were known faces at local fundraisers, fixtures at Sunday services, and the kind of men people nodded to at the grocery store. To outsiders, the four Grant brothers were pillars of strength, bonded by blood and business. To Isabella, they were simply her uncles, always present, always part of the family gatherings. That May, the family was invited to a week-long wedding celebration out of town. It was a big event, distant relatives, dancing, endless photos, and almost everyone packed their bags. Everyone, that is, except Isabella. With exams looming, she insisted on staying behind to study. Her parents reluctantly agreed, trusting their brothers to keep an eye on her. It seemed like a safe arrangement. Isabella at home, surrounded by family, with nothing more to worry about than textbooks and late-night coffee. It was supposed to be uneventful, even boring. But sometimes danger doesn't come from strangers or dark alleys. Sometimes it comes from inside the house, from people you've been told to trust your entire life. In the days ahead, boundaries would blur, loyalties would shatter, and the image of the perfect family would collapse in the most horrifying way imaginable. This story is not about strangers invading the Grants' quiet home. It's about what happens when betrayal grows from within, and when a father, faced with the unthinkable, takes justice into his own hands. Isabella had always thought of her uncles as extensions of her father, different personalities, but bound by the same blood, the same house, the same family name. When the wedding trip began and her parents left with suitcases packed, she assumed the week would be predictable. She'd spend her days cramming for exams in the upstairs study, making quick meals in the kitchen, maybe catching an old movie before bed. The three uncles would come and go, managing deliveries and paperwork for the family company, always busy, always a little gruff, but harmless. At least, that was what she believed. The first few days passed quietly. Isabella settled into a routine. Coffee at sunrise, textbooks sprawled across the dining table, the low hum of her laptop filling the silence. Occasionally, she heard the front door slam as Martin left for the office, or Peter's voice booming in the kitchen as he argued over the phone. Caleb, the youngest, was the most relaxed of the three, always lounging with a beer in hand, flipping through channels on the TV. Their presence was familiar, comforting even, like background noise in an otherwise lonely house. Then came the moment that changed everything. Isabella had just finished a late-night shower. Steam clung to the bathroom mirror as she wrapped herself in a towel and reached for her pajamas. The door creaked open, and before she could react, Martin stood in the doorway. His eyes widened, his face flushed red. For a brief second, the world seemed frozen. Her startled gasp, his heavy breathing, the awkward silence that followed. Then he muttered something, an apology that sounded more like an excuse, and quickly closed the door. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, heart pounding. It was a mistake, she told herself. He hadn't meant to. He would never. She convinced herself not to mention it to anyone, least of all her father. It would only cause unnecessary tension. Still, something about the way Martin had looked at her lingered in her mind. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was something else, something unsettling. The next day, she noticed subtle changes. Martin's eyes seemed to follow her longer than usual. When she walked past him in the hallway, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back. His comments, once playful and uncle-like, carried a new edge. "You've grown up so fast," he said one morning, his tone low, almost admiring. She forced a smile, but her stomach tightened. At dinner, the atmosphere grew heavier. Peter cracked jokes that fell flat, Caleb laughed too loudly, and Isabella found herself pushing food around her plate without eating. When she excused herself to return to her studies, she felt Martin's eyes on her again, burning holes into her retreating figure. She locked her bedroom door that night, a habit she'd never needed before. But even behind a locked door, she couldn't escape the tension creeping into the house. She began to notice how silence seemed sharper, how footsteps in the hallway felt deliberate, how the walls that once comforted her now seemed to close in. Her uncles weren't saying much, but their presence had shifted, less protective, more invasive. The incident in the bathroom replayed in her mind again and again. She tried to rationalize it. Martin had been tired, distracted, careless. But deep down, she knew the look she saw in his eyes was not an accident. It was hunger. And once you've seen hunger in someone who is supposed to love you like family, you can't unsee it. One evening, while she studied in the living room, Martin entered and lingered by the doorframe. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her scribble notes. When she finally looked up, he smirked faintly and said, "You remind me so much of your mother when she was young." The words struck her like a slap, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. She felt the implication, the thin veil of impropriety hiding behind his compliment. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to keep writing, pretending not to hear. Isabella thought of calling her parents, but what would she say? That her uncle looked at her too long? That his words made her uncomfortable? She feared sounding paranoid, or worse, that her father might confront Martin and tear the fragile fabric of their family apart. Her voice never reached the air. In the absence of words, boundaries blur. And in that house, with each passing day, the line between family and something far darker began to erode. Isabella felt the shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the first cracks forming in a dam. She didn't know it yet, but those cracks would soon give way to a flood. The night it happened began like so many others that week, quiet, ordinary, deceptively safe. Isabella had finished a long day of studying and was ready to collapse in a bed when Martin appeared at her door, a bottle of whiskey in his hand and a smile that looked too forced. "Come downstairs," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Let's celebrate. You're almost done with exams." At first, she resisted. Alcohol wasn't her thing, and she knew her father would disapprove. But Martin's persistence wore her down. He joked that she was too serious, that she needed to learn how to live a little. Against her better judgment, she joined him in the living room, where Peter and Caleb were already sitting with glasses in hand. The smell of liquor hung heavy in the air, mixing with the faint scent of takeout cartons left on the coffee table. At first, it felt harmless, just laughter, clinking glasses, stories about their younger days. But as the night dragged on, the tone shifted. Martin's hand lingered on her shoulder a little too long. Peter's compliments about how grown-up she looked came too easily. Caleb's laughter felt nervous, strained, as if he knew they were all teetering on the edge of something wrong. The moment the line was crossed was almost a blur. 1 minute, Isabella was sipping cautiously, cheeks flushed from the alcohol. The next, Martin leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear, and whispered something she couldn't bring herself to repeat. She froze, trying to laugh it off, but then his hand slid where it shouldn't have, and the room spun. She tried to push him away, but the others didn't stop it. In fact, they let it happen. Afterward, Isabella sat curled in her room, her body shaking, her mind refusing to process what had just been taken from her. She wanted to scream, to call her parents, to run out of the house barefoot into the night. But shame pinned her down. Fear chained her silence. How could she explain to her father that his own brothers had turned on her? How could she put words to something so unspeakable? She told herself it was an isolated moment, that it wouldn't happen again. But deep down, she already knew that wasn't true. The next morning, she avoided eye contact with everyone at breakfast. The men acted as though nothing had happened. Martin whistled while frying eggs. Peter read the paper. Caleb scrolled through his phone. To them, the night was already buried. To her, it was the beginning of a prison she couldn't escape. But secrets have a way of growing, and silence can turn into complicity. A few days later, Peter walked into her room unannounced. His face was serious, almost conflicted, but the moment he sat on her bed, she understood his intentions. She begged him to leave, to stop, but he didn't. His betrayal carved another wound in her soul. And when Caleb discovered what had been happening, she thought for a fleeting second that maybe he would protect her. Instead, he too surrendered to the sickness that had infected the house. What had started as one uncle's violation became a pattern, a cycle, a grotesque routine wrapped in secrecy. They convinced themselves that she was complicit, that her silence was agreement. They told her not to be so dramatic. That was their little family bond. And Isabella, terrified, ashamed, outnumbered, endured it in silence. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, and wondering which door would open next. Her textbooks remained spread across her desk, but the words blurred together. She couldn't focus. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Martin smirk, Peter's hand, Caleb's shadow. She wondered how something so ordinary, so safe, had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake from. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The Grants still waved to their neighbors, still appeared at Sunday service, still carried the mask of respectability. But inside the walls of that two-story home, Isabella was unraveling. Her once bright spirit dimmed. She spoke less, laughed never. The girl who had dreamed of college and independence now moved like a ghost through her own life. The worst part wasn't just the abuse. It was the manipulation, the way her uncles twisted her silence into consent, the way they hinted that if she ever spoke, no one would believe her. You wouldn't want to break your father's heart, would you? Martin whispered one night. The words sank into her chest like poison. They weren't just taking her body. They were taking her voice, her ability to fight back. Over time, the house itself began to feel like a trap. The familiar staircase, the cozy living room, the framed family photos on the walls. They all turned into cruel reminders of the double life she was forced to live. To everyone else, she was still the sweet, studious daughter of Thomas and Elena. But behind closed doors, she was the prisoner of 3 men who shared her blood. And as if the nightmare weren't enough, it was Martin who took things one step further. Late one evening, after another forced encounter, she noticed the faint red light of a camera in the corner of the room. Her stomach dropped. Martin wasn't just violating her in the moment. He was recording it, preserving it, turning her pain into something he could keep. She wanted to grab the device, to smash it, to destroy the evidence of her humiliation. But he warned her with a smile, "Don't worry. It's just for me." She didn't yet know it, but that recording, hidden on a USB drive and tucked away on Martin's phone, would be the very thing that set the final tragedy into motion. For now, though, Isabella remained trapped in the cycle, too afraid to speak, too ashamed to fight. The line between victim and secret bearer blurred, and the once bright light of her young life dimmed under the shadow of three men who should have protected her, but instead turned her world into something unspeakable. Martin thought he was clever. In his mind, the little red light of the camera was invisible, his secret tool to relive moments that should never have happened in the first place. But in that darkened bedroom, Isabella saw it. She knew what it meant. The truth of what her uncles had done was no longer just an unspoken nightmare. It had been captured, stored, made permanent. The next morning, Martin acted as if nothing had changed. He poured coffee, made a casual joke about traffic, even patted Caleb on the back like any other day. But Isabella's stomach twisted every time she glanced at him. He carried his phone with him constantly, guarding it like it was more valuable than his own wallet. Sometimes she caught him staring at the screen when he thought no one was looking, lips curled into a smirk. The video became a ghost that haunted every room of the house. Isabella knew it existed, but she didn't know how many copies there were, where they were hidden, or who else might see them. The possibility of exposure terrified her almost as much as the acts themselves. If anyone ever saw that footage, her mother, her father, the neighbors who waved politely from across the street, her shame would be broadcast in a way she couldn't bear. Peter noticed a shift too. He had always been the quieter one, the man who convinced himself he was only going along rather than leading. But when Martin bragged about having insurance, Peter's eyes darkened. He pulled Martin aside one evening and hissed, "What the hell are you thinking? You're going to get us caught." Martin only shrugged. "Relax. This keeps us safe. If she ever talks, we've got proof it was mutual." That word, mutual, burned Isabella's ears when she overheard it. She wanted to scream, to shatter the illusion that she had ever wanted any of this. But fear kept her silent, as it always did. Fear that her father would hate her. Fear that no one would believe her. Fear that the men in this house, the men who carried her last name, had already stolen her chance at being heard. Caleb, the youngest of the three, grew paranoid. He started drinking more, staying out later, avoiding eye contact at dinner. His guilt showed in nervous laughs and shaky hands. But even he didn't stop. None of them did. The video hung over all of them like a storm cloud. Every interaction dripped with suspicion. Did Martin have other recordings? Was he planning to use them? What if the phone was lost, or stolen, or discovered? For Isabella, each day became a performance. She sat at the dining table with her textbooks, pretending to study while her mind raced. She practiced smiles in the mirror, forcing herself to look normal when her mother called to check in. She answered questions from neighbors about school and finals with polite nods, never letting them glimpse the horror inside the house. But every time she saw Martin slip his phone into his pocket, every time she noticed the faint bulge of a USB drive in his jacket, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The tension among the brothers grew. Peter accused Martin of being reckless. Caleb muttered that they should stop before everything collapsed. Martin laughed at them both, drunk on control. "She's not saying anything," he sneered one night. "She knows better." And in a sick, twisted way, he was right. Her silence was their protection, and the recording was his weapon. But secrets don't stay buried forever. That little device, that careless arrogance, would become the very thing that unraveled them all. The irony was brutal. Martin believed the recording made him powerful. He thought it secured his dominance, bound Isabella to silence, and kept his brothers in line. In reality, it was the seed of destruction. Because when something is captured, when the truth is frozen in pixels and bytes, it can no longer be denied. It waits, biding its time, until the wrong hands discover it. And those hands belonged to Thomas Grant, the father who believed his daughter was safe in his own home, the man who trusted his brothers to protect what he valued most. He would return earlier than anyone expected, weary from travel, but grateful to be home. And when he did, the very recording Martin thought was his shield would be the blade that ripped their family apart. For now, though, the Grants sat together in their pristine suburban house, eating dinners that tasted of ash, smiling smiles that meant nothing, all while the truth sat hidden in a pocket, in a USB drive, in a phone waiting to be unlocked. A family still admired from the outside, but rotting from within. The video was more than evidence. It was a time bomb, and soon it would explode. Thomas Grant wasn't supposed to come home that night. The wedding festivities were still in full swing, music and laughter echoing through the rented banquet hall hours away. But exhaustion caught up with him. He told Elena he needed a break, that he'd return in the morning. The drive back was quiet, the road dark except for the sweep of headlights. He thought about Isabella, hoped she was studying and not overworking herself. He thought about his brothers, grateful they were there to keep an eye on her. That trust, that sense of family loyalty, was the very thing that made what he was about to discover so devastating. When Thomas pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a faint glow in the living room. He stepped inside quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. The smell of stale alcohol lingered in the air. On the couch, Martin was sprawled out, half asleep, his phone still in his hand. The screen glowed faintly. A video paused mid-frame. Thomas frowned. He reached down, intending to place the phone on the table before it slipped and shattered. But his eyes caught the frozen image, and his world stopped. It was Isabella, his daughter. For a moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. She was on the screen, her face twisted with fear, her body cornered. And surrounding her were his brothers, his own blood. He felt bile rise in his throat, his knees nearly giving way. He replayed it, praying he was mistaken, praying it was some sick misunderstanding. But each second confirmed the truth. The laughter he heard from his brothers, the hands he recognized, the voice of his daughter begging them to stop. It all burned into him with merciless clarity. Thomas sat frozen, his breath shallow, his hands shaking violently. Anger surged first, hot and violent. But underneath, it came a deeper wound, a grief so profound it nearly crushed him. The people he had trusted most had violated the person he loved most. In a single moment, the trust he had built his entire life disintegrated. Martin stirred and mumbled, eyes barely opening. Thomas snapped the phone shut and set it down, masking the storm raging inside him. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. Go to bed. Martin obeyed, too drunk to notice the change in his brother's face. Thomas stood alone in the living room, staring at the walls hung with family photos. Smiling faces, holiday portraits, birthdays celebrated. He thought of Isabella's first day of school, how she clutched his hand nervously. He thought of Elena, who trusted him to keep their daughter safe. And now this. He wanted to storm upstairs, drag Isabella into his arms, promise her it was over. He wanted to go to each brother's room and unleash the fury clawing at his chest. But something colder took root inside him. The rage didn't vanish, it crystallized. He understood, in a way that frightened even him, that there was no going back. This wasn't something to be fixed with apologies or cover with silence. Something had been broken that could never be repaired. For the next 24 hours, Thomas wore a mask. At breakfast, he sat at the table, coffee steaming in front of him, pretending everything was normal. Isabella's eyes were hollow, her voice barely above a whisper. His brothers joked about work, about deliveries and invoices, their laughter grating like knives. He watched them closely, every gesture dripping with hypocrisy. The phone sat on the counter, USB tucked away in Martin's bag. Evidence of the unspeakable was never more than an arm's length away. That evening, Thomas retreated to his study, pretending to catch up on paperwork. Instead, he paced the floor, his mind replaying the video again and again. He saw Isabella's face, her terror, her silence. He heard his brothers' voices, men he had once shared childhood secrets with, now monsters in his home. The walls of the study seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of betrayal. By midnight, his plan had taken shape. It wasn't something he decided lightly. It was something that seemed to decide itself. He would not go to the police, not yet. He would not confront them in the open. He would gather them all, look them in the eyes, and make them face what they had done. And then justice. The next morning, his voice was calm, almost cheerful. He suggested to his brothers that they take a short trip to the family's lake house to celebrate Isabella finishing exams. Martin grinned, oblivious. Peter nodded, suspicious but silent. Caleb hesitated, but eventually agreed. Isabella, confused and hesitant, went along only because her father asked. As Thomas packed, he moved with eerie precision. Clothes, food, a bottle of whiskey, and at the very bottom of his bag, a pistol he hadn't touched in years. He checked it twice, his hand steady now. There was no doubt, no hesitation. When they loaded into the car, the mood was light. Martin cracked jokes. Caleb fiddled with the radio. Isabella stared out the window in silence. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. The lake house awaited, its walls soon to bear witness to a reckoning decades in the making. What none of them knew, not even Isabella, was that the man driving the car was no longer just a father or a brother or a husband. He was something else now, something colder, something that had been born in the glow of a phone screen, in the sight of his daughter's suffering. And once born, there would be no stopping it. The lake house had always been a place of peace. Summer spent fishing off the dock, winters gathered by the fireplace, family photos still lined along the mantel. But when Thomas unlocked the door that evening, peace was the last thing on his mind. He moved methodically, setting out glasses, laying food on the table, opening a bottle of whiskey. He wanted everything to look normal, to feel normal, until it didn't. Martin was the first to relax, sprawling on the couch with a smirk, already reaching for the bottle. Peter and Caleb followed, their laughter filling the room, too loud, too careless. Isabella sat quietly near the window, arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the dark water beyond the glass. She didn't understand why her father had insisted on this trip. Something in his eyes unsettled her, but she trusted him because she always had. Tonight, Thomas said as he raised his glass, we celebrate Isabella. She's finishing her exams, stepping into her future. A proud moment for all of us. His voice was steady, almost warm. The brothers clinked glasses, congratulating Isabella with exaggerated cheer. She forced a thin smile, her stomach churning. The night unfolded like a play, each act rehearsed in Thomas's mind. They ate, they drank, they laughed. For a moment, it almost felt like any other family gathering. But underneath the surface, tension coiled tight, waiting for release. When the plates were cleared and the last glass of whiskey was poured, Thomas stood. He walked to the corner of the room where he had set up the old projector. I have something special to show, he announced, his tone deceptively calm. His brothers looked curious, tipsy grins plastered across their faces. Isabella turned, confused. The screen flickered to life. At first, just static. Then the video. Her voice. Their faces. The sounds of a night that should never have existed. The room fell silent except for Isabella's muffled gasp. Her hand shot to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. The brothers froze, their laughter dying instantly. Martin lurched forward, shouting, "Turn it off. What the hell are you doing?" Peter cursed under his breath. Caleb stammered, "Thomas, listen. This isn't." But Thomas didn't listen. He stood with his back straight, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the screen. Every frame was a knife in his chest, but he forced himself to watch. He wanted them all to see it, to feel it, to know there was no more hiding. "You did this," Thomas said finally, his voice low, shaking with fury. "To her, to my daughter, to your own blood." Martin stepped forward, hands raised, trying to take control. "It's not what you think. She didn't say no. We." The words made Isabella sob, her entire body trembling. Thomas's hand slipped beneath his jacket, fingers closing around the cold metal of the pistol. "Don't you dare," Thomas growled, his voice breaking. "Don't you dare blame her." The brothers erupted in panic, their voices clashing in desperate pleas and excuses. Caleb backed toward the door, muttering about mistakes, about fixing things. Peter tried to calm Thomas, speaking in measured tones, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Martin, defiant even in the face of exposure, sneered. "You think you can sit in judgment of us? You don't understand." The first shot cut him off. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and final. Martin fell backward, his body crumpling against the table, glass shattering beneath him. Blood spread across the wood like spilled ink. For a moment, silence. Then chaos. Peter shouted, lunging toward Thomas. Another shot rang out, striking him in the chest. He stumbled, eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing near the hearth. Caleb screamed, scrambling for the door, but Thomas turned and fired again. The bullet caught in the side, sending him crashing into the wall before sliding down, clutching at the wound. The smell of gunpowder filled the room, mixing with the sharp tang of blood. Isabella screamed, her voice raw, pleading, "Daddy, stop, please." Thomas stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, pistol still raised. His brothers lay scattered around him, two motionless, one groaning in agony. He turned to Isabella, his face etched with pain. "You're safe now," he whispered. But even as the words left his mouth, something darker twisted inside him. He looked at her, the daughter he had sworn to protect, and all he could see was the video. Her image frozen on the screen, violated, broken. He couldn't separate her from what they had done. Tears streamed down Isabella's face. "It wasn't me, Daddy. I didn't want this. They made me." Her voice cracked, desperate. Thomas's hand trembled. His finger hovered on the trigger. In his mind, a war raged. The father who loved her, and the man who couldn't unsee the stain his brothers had left. "I know you didn't," he said softly, almost lovingly. "But they took something from you. And now it's gone. They left you with nothing but shame." His voice broke, his eyes wild. "And I can't let you live with that." Isabella shook her head violently, backing away, her sobs turning to screams. "No, please, Daddy, don't." The final shot shattered the night. Her body crumpled to the floor, the last light in Thomas's world extinguished by his own hand. The cabin was silent now, save for the crackle of the fireplace and the ringing in Thomas's ears. He stood alone, surrounded by blood and silence, the pistol heavy in his hand. Slowly, he sank into a chair, staring blankly at the carnage. His brothers, his daughter, his family, gone. When the phone rang in his pocket, he answered with a steady voice. Elena's worried tone filled his ear. He closed his eyes, tears spilling freely at last. "It's done," he whispered. "They hurt her. I stopped them. I stopped everything." Then he set the phone down, placed the pistol on the table, and waited. The sirens would come soon, and with them, the world's judgment. But in Thomas's mind, the judgment had already been delivered. The call came into dispatch just after midnight. A man's voice, calm, steady, almost hollow, confessed to multiple murders at the Grant family's lake house. The operator asked his name. "Thomas Grant," he replied. "I killed my brothers. I killed my daughter." He gave the address, then set the phone down. When deputies arrived, the cabin looked frozen in time. The front door stood ajar, the faint smell of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Inside, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. 3 men lay sprawled across the floor, each bearing fatal gunshot wounds. Near the window, the body of a young woman, Isabella, her lifeless eyes staring upward. Her father's jacket draped over her as though he had tried to cover her in a final, futile gesture of protection. Thomas sat in a wooden chair near the fireplace, hands folded, pistol on the table beside him. He didn't resist when officers entered. He didn't speak. He only looked at his daughter one last time as they led him away in handcuffs. The news spread quickly. By dawn, the quiet lakeside community was flooded with flashing lights, crime scene tape, and reporters clamoring for details. The Grants had been pillars of the town, their logistics business employing dozens of locals. Now, that same family name was plastered across headlines. Father Slaughter's daughter and brothers in Lake House bloodbath. At first, the story seemed simple. A family man snapped, killing those closest to him. But then investigators discovered the recording. Hidden in Martin's phone was the video Thomas had played before pulling the trigger. Detectives watched in grim silence as the truth unfolded. Isabella, terrified, surrounded by her uncles. The footage confirmed everything Thomas had claimed at his call. Detective Carla Hughes, lead investigator, later told the press, "In 20 years on the force, I've never seen anything like it. The video was undeniable. It showed not only the crime against Isabella, but also the catalyst for the violence that followed. Without it, this case might have looked like a senseless mass killing. With it, we saw the full tragedy. The video was entered into evidence, sealed under strict court order, but rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the footage was worse than anyone could imagine. Others argued that the video vindicated Thomas, painting him as a father who acted out of unbearable pain. The legal proceedings began 3 months later, and the courtroom was packed from the very first day. Journalists filled the back rows. Activists gathered outside, some holding signs that read justice for Isabella, others holding placards that said free the father. The case divided the public in a way few trials ever had. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Carling Nguyen, argued that Thomas had committed premeditated murder. "Ladies and gentlemen," she told the jury in her opening statement, the defendant had choices. He could have called the police the moment he discovered the abuse. He could have protected his daughter without taking lives. Instead, he orchestrated a gathering, lured his brothers under false pretenses, and executed them one by one. And then, most chilling of all, he turned the gun on his daughter, the very person he claimed to protect. That is not justice. That is not self-defense. That is murder. The defense painted a different picture. Their attorney described Thomas as a man undone by trauma, someone who snapped after witnessing the unthinkable. They called psychologists who testified about acute stress reaction and temporary insanity. One expert told the jury, when Mr. Grant saw that video, his brain experienced it as if the assault were happening in real time. He was overwhelmed by rage and grief, unable to distinguish rational action from violent impulse. The trial stretched on for weeks, testimony after testimony peeling back the layers of the tragedy. Elena, heartbroken, took the stand. She spoke about her marriage, her daughter, and the night she received Thomas's chilling phone call. He said he had stopped them, she whispered through tears. "I wanted to believe he meant he stopped the abuse, but then I realized what he had done." Neighbors spoke of the family's reputation, their shock at the killings. Former employees of the company described the brothers as hard-nosed businessmen, but never suspected the darkness beneath. Detectives described recovering the USB drive, the phone, the bloodstains. The jury listened, their faces pale, their eyes heavy. The hardest moment came when the video itself was played in the courtroom. Jurors squirmed, some turning away. Isabella's voice filled the silent chamber, her cries echoing through the speakers. The defense objected, calling it prejudicial, but the judge allowed it, saying the jury had to understand the catalyst. When the lights came back on, Thomas sat hunched at the defense table, tears streaking his face, his hands trembling. Public opinion split further. Some called him a monster who compounded one crime with another. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a father destroyed by the betrayal of his brothers and the violation of his child. Talk shows debated it nightly. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Isabella and hashtag Father or Killer trended for weeks. Finally, the jury deliberated. After 2 days, they returned with their verdict: guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, solemn and unflinching, sentenced Thomas Grant to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, Thomas didn't flinch. He only closed his eyes, as though he had expected nothing less. Elena wept quietly in the gallery. For her, there were no victories, no justice, only ashes. In the weeks that followed, the town struggled to reconcile what had happened. The Grant family name, once synonymous with success, became a ghost that haunted every corner of the community. The logistics company shut down, its employees scattered. The house in the suburbs sat empty, a for sale sign out front that no one dared answer. The case became a national cautionary tale, taught in law schools, debated in psychology journals, dissected in true crime documentaries. It forced people to ask impossible questions. Where does justice end and vengeance begin? What happens when the protector becomes the executioner? And in the end, who suffers most? The victim of the crime or the family left to live with the aftermath? For Thomas, those questions no longer mattered. He spent his days in a prison cell, staring at gray walls, haunted by the memory of a daughter he couldn't save and couldn't stop himself from destroying. And for the rest of the world, the story of the Grants was no longer about a perfect family. It was about how quickly perfection can collapse into horror. When the trial ended and the cameras left the courthouse steps, the town tried to move on. But the shadow of the Grants lingered everywhere. The two-story house in the suburbs, once the pride of the block, stood dark and silent. Weeds crept through the front yard. Curtains remained drawn, as if the house itself was ashamed of what had happened inside. Neighbors whispered when they passed. Unable to reconcile the cheerful holiday lights, they remembered with the grim reality of a family destroyed. Elena never returned. Within weeks of the verdict, she sold the property and moved to another county. She took nothing from the house except a small box of Isabella's belongings, a hairbrush, a few notebooks, a silver necklace Isabella had worn on her graduation day. Elena used the proceeds from the sale to start over, dedicating herself to counseling families who had endured trauma and loss. She told a reporter once, "If I can keep even one family from collapsing the way mine did, then maybe something good can come out of all this pain." Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lost everything. The Grant brothers were buried quietly, their funerals sparsely attended. Few wanted to be seen honoring men whose crimes had been exposed so brutally. Isabella's service was different. Friends, classmates, even strangers gathered in a small chapel to light candles in her memory. They remembered her as bright, kind, and full of promise. A young woman whose life was stolen not once, but twice. First by her uncles, then by the father who couldn't see past his own grief. The community remained divided. Some residents defended Thomas even after the conviction, calling him a man who did what the system could not. Any father would have lost his mind seeing that video, one neighbor insisted to a local paper. Others were horrified, arguing that Thomas's final act, turning the gun on Isabella, proved he was no hero, only another destroyer in a chain of violence. Online, the debate raged for months under competing hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Isabella versus hashtag Father or Avenger. In prison, Thomas faded into routine. Guards described him as polite, withdrawn, a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. He refused interviews, ignored letters from strangers, and kept a small Bible by his bunk. Inmates called him the Avenger, but Thomas never acknowledged it. When asked once by a prison chaplain if he regretted what he had done, he reportedly answered, "Every second." But it was already too late the moment I saw that screen. Years later, the Grant story still surfaces in documentaries, podcasts, and law school ethics classes. It is held up as a tragic case study of justice gone wrong, of how silence breeds rot, of how vengeance, no matter how righteous it feels, only multiplies the body count. The lake house was eventually demolished. In its place, tall grass grew wild, as though nature itself wanted to erase the memory of blood on its floors. But erasure is impossible. For those who lived through it, the neighbors, the classmates, the town, the story of the Grants is not a tale to forget. It is a reminder whispered in every quiet street, in every locked door, in every family portrait. Perfection is fragile, and when it cracks, the pieces can cut deep enough to destroy everyone.